The Formed Book Club. Catholic book lovers unpacking good books, chapter by chapter.
Welcome to the Formed Book Club, where Joseph Pierce, who looks to me like the Michelin Man, is joining us from wintry South Carolina. And Vivian and myself, we're going to continue our discussion of The Lost Mandate of Heaven by Geoffrey Shaw. And we are going to take up Chapter 9, The Decline of the Nolting Influence, Nolting being the ambassador of the U.S. to Saigon, to South Vietnam. At some points, I think, well, taking a long time through this book, but I mean, every chapter I read, I think, wait a minute, this is so contemporary. There's something to learn here for our country and other countries. How should countries interact, and what's for the best of each country and for both and for the world at large. And you see this interplay of persons that at the time, it certainly wasn't as easy to determine who was right, who was wrong, who was perhaps trying to influence things in a way that was personal and who was not. But now with the distance of history, to me, it's coming into focus what should have been done, what should not have been done, who are the villains, and I mean real villains in this, and who are the heroes. And here's one of the heroes for me, Ambassador Nolting, the decline of his influence. Vivian?
Well, this chapter begins with, we're in 1963. And, in 1963, this is a really big year. Nolting is going to be replaced as the ambassador. Diem is going to be assassinated on November 2nd. And JFK is going to be assassinated on November 22nd. All of that is going to happen in this one pivotal year. And leading up to this, we saw how these two sides were forming in the U.S. government, two very opposing sides on how the policy should be implemented in Vietnam to protect it against it falling to communism. And you had the Harriman Group at the State Department with their wanting more control over Diem's government, more control over military operations, and a more conventional military approach. And then on the other side, you had Ambassador Nolting, you had members of the CIA, even members of the U.S. military who wanted to keep an arm's length from handling the war directly, to give support to the legitimate government. And 1963 is going to be the year when that fatal decision is made to withdraw support from Diem. And I think this quote on page 176 is so important. In the middle there, the historical record places the responsibility for the fate of South Vietnam upon the shoulders of specific individuals, powerful men within the Kennedy administration who directly and intentionally abrogated America's pledges to President Diem's government. Their decisions resulted in the destruction of the South Vietnamese government and created a moral imperative for the United States to fill the political vacuum they produced with military might. A political vacuum they produced with military might. Father just said, there's so much to learn here. Yes, because we keep doing the same thing over and over and over again with U.S. foreign policy. We create political vacuums that then we try to create with military might. And when has this worked? And I just, for the record, want to bring our attention to the fact that this is 1963. We had troops in Vietnam until 1973, 10 years. And beginning in 1965, we began drafting 1,000 U.S. young men per day to send over to Vietnam, with this peaking in 1969 with 540,000 American young men fighting in Vietnam.
There was a song, sort of a rap song that was a hit in the 90s that said that in World War II, the average age of the combat soldier, presumably American combat soldier, was I think 26 or something. So in Vietnam it was 19. That was the average age of the combat soldier in Vietnam, of the American soldiers, 19.
So in any case, with all of that, and then of course we know we had 50,000 die, that number can seem large to some people. It can seem small to others because you know what? 50,000 Americans died at Gettysburg in the Civil War, one battle, 50,000 men. So, but by the same token, what was the benefit of this cost of human life? You know, if you're going to put people's lives on the line, there better be a good outcome. There better be some beneficial.
And I think we have the right, with the wisdom of hindsight, which history and this book in particular affords us, to point the fingers. Right, there's the breaking of the pledge, right? So that's just a breaking of a promise, and then the creation of the vacuum, which basically causes a war that takes another 12 years after this to. Well, even then it's not over. We retreat. So who's to blame for this? And I'd say he names certain people there, but I think what he doesn't name there is the American media, the press. You know, that people should point the finger at the liberal media for causing the 50,000 deaths and the war in Vietnam, which they would also then could be at the forefront of trying to undermine. But they caused it, right? Because of their reporting of what was happening in Vietnam. And the other thing I want to say is that just to continue the one sentence further from where you read there, Vivian, or two sentences, Ambassador Nolting, as the senior State Department man on the ground in South Vietnam at that time, stood against these men. During the course of his protest, however, he was replaced as ambassador in the summer of 1963. So the first vacuum that was replaced was that was caused was the removal of Ambassador Nolting, and he does, as Father said, stand as a hero in this. When we can point the finger of accusation against all sorts of people, we really should do nothing but applaud Ambassador Nolting for his efforts.
And you brought up the 50,000 killed in action in Vietnam. But what about how many Vietnamese were killed?
Yes, I don't even know.
I mean, I think it's over 1 million.
I would not be surprised.
And then what were the effects in this country of what we did in that war? It created, or it increased the resistance to authority and tradition and so on.
Oh, for sure. That had more to do with the social upheaval of this country. I mean, we also had the civil rights movement kicking into gear. And but really, the draft, what that did to American youth in the 60s was, almost unmeasurable.
So
there is a sort of justifiable cynicism, which obviously, part of the vacuum caused by that is the rise of woke. Right, but there's a justifiable cynicism against this sort of conservative cynicism we see in place here, where basically realpolitik, Machiavellian, unprincipled realpolitik leads to the betrayal of friends, to lies, to subservience to the whims of ideologically driven media in order to get re-elected in the election. When all of these things, obviously, this is going to undermine your confidence in the system. And justifiably so, quite frankly, Well,
that's right.
I was alive, and I was no longer a minor in 1963, but I was in just between the novitiate of the Jesuits and what's called the juniorate, and we were pretty much isolated from any, current events at that time. But I think to myself, had I been, a more mature adult in 1963, whose side would I have been on? I'm not sure, because you look at the situation, you say, well, here's what the media is saying, here's what you're learning from elsewhere. There's some very people who are quite responsible people like Averell Harriman who are taking a position. I might have been on what I now see to be the wrong side. Just as I think sometimes if I'd been alive in Christ's time, I probably would have been a Pharisee. Which kind of Pharisee would I have been? The majority of Pharisees who rejected him, or the minority who accepted him? I can't say for certain that I would have been on the right side of that thing. Nevertheless, once we look back and see what happened, it should give us principles, cautionary principles, to address current problems, so we don't we try to avoid the same mistake as because think what would have happened if this man, who apparently was a good, serious, talented Catholic statesman, Diem, had been supported, and there would have been a cooperation between what they wanted to do as a counterinsurgency and what we want to do to help, so that we would have adapted ourselves to the cultural situation and the needs of the circumstances. And then we would have won that war. And we would have not had this rebellion. I mean, these what ifs of history are pretty phenomenal, because it could have made a huge difference in the history of this country and of Vietnam.
Well, and the terrible.
Sorry, the irony is as well, that next page 177 here, at the time, immediately after all these bad guys here who are working to undermine Diem's government, to remove him, to lie, to cheat, the media, everything else, that objectively speaking, according to this CIA report, the war militarily at the beginning of 1963 was being won.
That's right.
Yeah.
So objectively speaking, the tactics and strategy being used by Diem and supported by Ambassador Nolting were being successful. And they were undermined because of people like Harriman's hatred of Diem and the Western media's ideologically driven hatred of Diem. And so the war basically, the greatest allies of the Viet Cong were the Western media and certain members of the U.S. government, quite frankly.
And it was not only the CIA report from operatives on the ground in Vietnam who were actually going to these places and seeing what was happening, who reported that the war was being won, the counterinsurgency was being won, but also the Joint Chiefs of Staff submitted a report called the Wheeler Report that said the same thing. So you even had top American military, they often take a lot of blame for the conduct of the war. But you have to remember that the U.S. military is governed by the democratically elected leaders of the country. They are a political extension of a political decision-making process. And so you can have good military advice that's just completely ignored because, of what the political winds are influencing events, people to do. So the Wheeler Report also, this is described on 178. And interestingly enough, at the bottom of 178, that last graph, it says, the Wheeler Report identified the strategic hamlets as the greatest single political military instrument the government of Vietnam had for making themselves relevant to the rural South Vietnamese. Well, that was exactly Diem's position. That was exactly what he was trying to do. That was where he was putting all of his efforts, was on these strategic hamlets. As we know, the brainchild of this counterinsurgency expert, the British Thompson, who had seen them work in Malaysia. And then here we have elections had been held in over 1,000 hamlets. Well, isn't that what these people in the Department of State said they wanted? More democracy? Well, if they had gone and looked, they would have seen at the local level, democracy was growing.
I think the problem is, and it's on page 179 there, that these are all the facts. This is the objective data. This is the reality on the ground. But that first new paragraph there on page 179, Wheeler's team recognized that opposite their positive view, we should also say objective view, was the American media's negative one, we should also say subjective view. So basically, it doesn't really matter what's true if it's going to be spun propagandistically by ideologues in the media.
That's right. That's right. And so in the next few chapters here, we're going to see more and more of this destructive media spin as we go on. Yes. Now about the importance of these hamlets, something here that's to Father's point about learning lessons for today. So on the middle of 178, the bottom of the middle paragraph, we see attached to the fundamental problem was the historical reality that the central government of Vietnam had never before done anything to improve the lives of the peasants, nor had the peasants ever linked themselves, their activities, or their futures with the central government. As a result, they had no comprehension of national political issues, of what really was at stake if the communists took over the whole country. This was noted in the Wheeler Report. Now, what's interesting about that is the parallel this has with Afghanistan. When the government in Kabul of Afghanistan was under threat and we sought to prop up that government, we immediately saw that the big problem was that as far as the people in the countryside were concerned, they had no connection whatsoever to that government. The reason why the Taliban were so effective in winning over the people was that they went into the villages, they began administering justice and methods that they understood. Oh, this guy stole your goat? Well, here he's bringing your goat back.
And
if, and if he doesn't, there's going to be consequences. The federal central government, way off somewhere else, had absolutely no connection whatsoever to these people's lives. And this was the genius of Diem, to understand that the only way you're going to build any kind of trust on the part of these villagers and peasants with any kind of government in Saigon would be if they got actual results in their lives: security, minimal justice, being able to live their lives in peace, and so on, which is what the Hamlet program was designed to do.
This is absolutely, for one who's sort of been very keen on promoting the church's social teaching, this is vindication, right? Because you don't get solidarity unless you have subsidiarity, right? They're the two pillars. And that's basically what Diem was understanding. We want solidarity in the war against communism. We have to have subsidiarity. We have to have grassroots support based upon grassroots security. And he understood that. But these big central governments just understand that we impose our will from a distance upon areas people are not even in the mix. Persons on anyway, right? So what's going to happen if anybody's actually seriously on the ground? They're going to win.
Yep. The other interesting note that the Wheeler Report made was mentioned here on 179, the top of the second paragraph. No, that was what you just. That's what you just quoted, right, Joseph, about the opposition of the media. This other quote. The Wheeler Report, the paragraph above that, 179, the Wheeler Report concluded that the Americans were not in a position to direct the government of Vietnam. We were not in a position to, if we took this government down, we were not in a position to replace it. And that gets pointed out several times as the book chapter progresses, that we didn't have anybody to take their place. So what were we doing? Creating a political vacuum.
Yeah, and in the chapters leading up to the assassination, never once that I've seen has one name been mentioned of a serious rival to Diem who has a following that they could actually back instead of Diem to have a legitimate alternative leader. No names mentioned.
And in fact,
just basically they use the military to overthrow him.
And on page 183 specifically, William Colby, this is toward the bottom of the page there, William Colby, his successor John Richardson, so these are CIA men, Robert Thompson, the British counterinsurgency expert, all agreed with Nolting's estimation of the civilian opposition in Saigon that they were not fit to lead a coup or a headless country. So that's why what we ended up with were the generals being given the reins. The generals of the South Vietnamese army were given control of the government because there was no civilian capable alternative.
Right.
Let me ask a question about something which may be stepping back a little too far, but in the 19th century, the United States was by far an agrarian country, and most of the people lived outside the cities. Certainly by the 20th century and into that, we became highly urbanized. So we became an urban society. The majority of the population is not in the countryside. So did we forget our own history and heritage there so that we could not understand how it works in a country which is not urbanized like ours is, where the vast number of people are working on little farms and little holdings. And not understanding that, we thought the urban, top-down military solution would work, and we wanted to see democracy on that level nationally, totally overlooking the fact that most people don't care about that.
Yeah,
Right?
it's not. I think it's even worse than that, Father, because it's not ignorance; it's arrogance, in the sense that what comes with urbanization is a belief in centralization, a belief that big is best, and that that small agrarian communities are ipso facto primitive and backward, and they're not efficient. So so it's also looking down superciliously on these people as being primitive and backwards because they live in agrarian societies.
And then on top of that, you have what you're both describing as a built-in prejudice on the part. Who are these young reporters going to Vietnam to report on this situation and build their careers, maybe winning prizes and so on? They're college educated from metropolitan centers like New York City and Washington, D.C. and so on. They go to a place like Vietnam. They probably have nothing but contempt for the place. And here we have on 182, with deadlines for filling stories ever present, reporters understandably preferred the convenient Saigon gossip circle interview over the far-flung, difficult, and often dangerous interview with a peasant in a remote hamlet. And the young and experienced reporters, this is in the next graph down, hopeful of launching their careers with a sensational story that could make the front page. Well, the sensational story is going to be some inglorious defeat. It's going to be some political scandal. It's going to be some proof of repression, which is what the Buddhist crisis is going to provide for these people in the next chapter. Yeah.
But actually, again, ironically, this is the path of least resistance. They stay with the bourgeoisie in the urban areas. They find the easiest way to get a sensational story. No one's actually doing the grassroots work to get to know the people, to really care about the people, to find out what the people think. So these people are sitting in judgment, in their arrogance about the people of Vietnam without making any real effort whatsoever to get to know them, to get their hands dirty, right, by actually going to the villages, taking the risks, so to me, these people are worthy of contempt.
Well, you might ask, okay, so the U.S. government had at their disposal their own intelligence operatives providing information, their own military providing information, and we're going to see in the next chapter, Thompson goes to Washington because they're actually going to bring him to Washington. Okay, what the media, yes, but also we had the damning Mansfield report in March of 1963. It was actually produced before the Joint Chiefs report, but it wasn't made public till after the Joint Chiefs report. And Mansfield, a senator, the majority leader, a former friend of Diem, this report Nolting describes as the first nail in the coffin of Diem's coffin. That's what Nolting calls it.
Where is this, Vivian?
The Mansfield report is introduced on 184, and Nolting calling it the first nail in Diem's coffin is in the middle of 185. And then we find out, though, not until page 191 at the top, Nolting said, okay, this is Ambassador Nolting, said that Mansfield had, quote, gotten most of his information, I think, from the American Press Corps in Saigon. In other words, when Mansfield visited Vietnam, where did he go? Did he go out to the hamlets and to the countryside? Probably not, because we all know that when American political leaders go on these fact-finding trips, they get the dog and pony show. They get the whole thing is orchestrated. It's political theater. They don't necessarily get to talk to rank and file people, or it's all set up for them. And they fly in, they fly out, and they deliver a report on the floor of Congress, and the media's all over it.
A little bit off topic, but maybe only partly. But that reminds me very much of H.G. Wells, who went to Stalin's Soviet Union in the 1930s and was met Stalin and was shown all the beautiful, wonderful factories, and came back and was talking about how the Soviet Union's a modern utopia where everything is perfect. And this was the very moment when the Ukrainian famine's happening. So and this is how someone who's gullible, who wants to believe, can just be shown what he wants to see, And
in this case, though, it's kind of an inverse of that, because here that fellow is being hidden. What's going on in the countryside is being hidden, right? In this case, this guy goes and he's relying on American reporters who've been there to tell him what's going on, doesn't realize that the American reporters aren't going out into the countryside, aren't really reporting the facts on the ground as they should be, because they've already turned in their minds against Diem as some right-wing authoritarian dictator type.
Yeah.
We have a current example of this. We're in San Francisco, Vivian and I. We had a visit from Xi. That's not a pronoun. That's the name of a Chinese leader. But they didn't take him to San Francisco. They took him up down the peninsula to Millbrae, I think, or someplace like Hillsborough.
For the meeting between him and President Biden, it was at this estate that was built by someone who made a fortune in California. I don't remember if it was railways or whatever. It's all beautifully cultivated, beautiful gardens, beautiful manor house, and so on. That's where the meeting actually took place.
Yeah. Not in the Tenderloin.
Yeah, in Woodside, highest, per capita income compacted into one small place in practically the world. Yeah, Here's poor President Kennedy now. He's up for re-election in 1964.
That's another thing.
Yeah.
Why is our foreign policy so dependent upon election?
I know, and he's stuck with trying to make a decision about what to do. We have him on 187 saying, I don't see. Oh, so the Mansfield report, at least Mansfield had the decency to say, okay, this is a disaster. We should just get out of here. Just walk away, right? That was kind of the attitude, and let's not keep spending U.S. tax dollars and blah, 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 blah. So here, poor Kennedy is caught between my military people say this, my senator friend says this, my ambassador is saying this, my State Department is saying that, I'm running for re-election, and my campaign managers are saying this. And here Kennedy says on 187, I don't see how we are going to be able, unless we're going to pull out of Southeast Asia and turn it over to the communists, how we're going to be able to reduce very much our economic programs and military programs in South Vietnam, in Cambodia, in Thailand, etc. So here's Kennedy sticking to the Eisenhower foreign policy imperative that the United States is going to support any nation trying to resist a communist takeover. That's the foreign policy Kennedy inherited and probably believed in it too. I'm not saying he just inherited an old something or other that didn't think was important anymore. He obviously thought it was important to protect Southeast Asia from a complete communist takeover. But he's not able to decide on the tools that would have brought that about. There's a tragedy here.
Yeah. And the chapter, as we're getting towards the end of the 30 minutes here, I mean, I don't think we need to read it, but the final paragraph in the chapter, page 192 to 193, basically just sums up that the situation that's being left by these various forces at work is a vacuum. And this vacuum is obviously dangerous, and it's going to be filled by those hundreds of thousands of American draftees that were GIs who were sent over there throughout the 1960s, early 70s. That's what's going to fill the vacuum.
Yep.
The vacuum is going to be filled by U.S. military. And as Father said, obviously, hundreds of thousands of Vietnamese are going to die as well.
That's right.
Well, a couple of things I want to just mention briefly before we conclude the chapter. 190 towards the top there. Thompson, this is actually from Malaya, handed Harriman a rebuttal to his claim that the fault for negative reporting lay with Diem. He bluntly told the Americans that the entire government would collapse without Diem and that the counterinsurgency effort would be left in serious disarray. And this is a reminder, and it's true for all and for all circumstances. We have to learn how to discern whom we can trust and rely on and whom we can't. And that, to me, is the role of a liberal education. You read widely, you read different points of view, you read Marx, you read Thomas Aquinas, you read Nietzsche, you read Montaigne, and you find out what are the characteristics of someone you can rely on. On page 191, also ends up at the bottom of page 199 there, Also unjust according to Nolting was the 1962 Mansfield Report, which American reporters continue to rate that as a source of information. Ironically, the report was based in part on these very same reporters. And that's happening now. You get one narrative that starts, and it gets quoted by someone else as if, oh, wait a minute, everybody sees the same thing. Well, no, wait a minute. One person planted the idea, and it just was like fire in a stubble field,
That's right.
Scripture tells us.
That's right. You see that even more so amplified with social media. The same misinformation gets quoted over and over and over again. And what's the old adage? If you repeat it long enough, people believe it's true.
Or if you have the loudest voice, so that you can bellow the lie and drown out the truth, then the lie will. Well, it won't triumph ultimately. I don't believe that, but it certainly has an advantage temporarily.
Anything more on this chapter?
Nope.
Those listening and watching, if you got a question, call in. Of course, there's no number. Well, we'll see you next week to answer your questions. God bless you.
If you enjoyed this discussion, please help spread the word about the Forum Book Club by subscribing to the podcast and writing a review. You can sign up for weekly updates at formedbookclub.ignatius.com.